You think being a Roman empress meant unlimited power and freedom. Think again. In first-century Rome, women of the imperial family lived inside the most elaborate surveillance system the ancient world had ever created. Every move watched, every relationship scrutinized, every moment of their lives balanced on a knife's edge between privilege and execution. When Valeria Messalina married Emperor Claudius around 38 to 40 AD, she was somewhere between 15 and 20 years old. Her husband was approximately 50, physically disabled, and had spent most of his life being mocked by his own family as an embarrassment to the imperial dynasty. But he was emperor, which meant Messalina had just inherited the most dangerous job in Rome, being the emperor's wife. Here's what most people don't understand about Roman empresses. They weren't just decorative accessories. Women of the imperial family wielded real political power, controlled enormous wealth, and influenced decisions that affected millions of people across the empire. Livia, wife of Augustus, had essentially corralled Rome for decades. Agrippina the Elder had commanded such loyalty that her enemies needed to destroy her to maintain control. But this power came with a price that would terrify anyone. Every empress existed under constant observation by a system designed to detect the slightest hint of disloyalty or impropriety. Palace guards reported their movements, servants monitored their visitors, political enemies watched for any mistake they could exploit, and Roman law had a simple solution for imperial women who stepped out of line: exile, forced suicide, or execution. The rules were crystal clear, even if unwritten. An empress could advise her husband privately, but never be seen as controlling him. She could accumulate wealth, but never appear greedy. She could have her own household and clients, but never build an independent power base that might threaten the emperor. And above all, her sexual conduct had to be absolutely beyond reproach, because in Rome, a wife's adultery wasn't just a personal betrayal. When the wife was an empress, adultery became treason against the state itself. Messalina had watched what happened to women who forgot these rules. Julia, daughter of Augustus, had been exiled to a barren island for adultery and died there in misery. Julia Livilla, Messalina's own cousin, would be exiled and killed during Claudius's reign, accused of conspiracy and sexual misconduct. The message couldn't be clearer: step out of line, and the system would destroy you completely. But Messalina had something most empresses didn't have. She had given Claudius 2 children, a daughter, Claudia Octavia, born in 39 or 40 AD, and a son, Britannicus, born in 41 AD, in a dynasty desperate for legitimate heirs. This made her nearly untouchable, or so she thought. The imperial palace at Rome wasn't just a residence. It was a political battlefield where emperors' wives competed with freedmen's secretaries, where senators plotted advancement, and where a single accusation could end in a bloodbath. 3 men effectively controlled access to Claudius Narcissus' palace and Callistus, former slaves who had risen to become the most powerful administrators in the empire. They managed Rome's finances, correspondence, and judicial system, and they had absolutely no intention of letting an empress interfere with their control. Here's the brutal reality that Messalina faced. She had power, yes, but that power depended entirely on her husband's favor and the tolerance of men who saw her as a threat to their own influence. She lived in a gilded cage where every privilege came with surveillance, every freedom had limits, and every moment of independence was noted by people who might use it against her. For most empresses, the solution was simple: stay within the boundaries, exercise power quietly, and survive. But Messalina, according to every ancient source that mentions her, decided to play a different game entirely. She would test every limit, cross every boundary, and dare the system to stop her. And ancient historians claim she started with the most shocking transgression imaginable for a woman of her status. But here's what you need to understand before we go further. Every single story about Messalina comes from sources written by men who hated her, written after she was dead and couldn't defend herself, written in a culture that routinely destroyed powerful women by accusing them of sexual depravity. So as we dive into the most scandalous tale ever told about a Roman empress, keep asking yourself, did this really happen? Or did Rome's elite need to believe it happened to justify what they eventually did to her? Picture this. Somewhere in the back alleys of Rome, in one of the city's many brothels, the Empress of Rome is engaged in a sexual competition with one of the city's most famous prostitutes, not in secret, not in disguise. According to Pliny the Elder, writing about 30 years after Messalina's death, this actually happened. Here's what Pliny specifically claims in his Natural History. Written around 77 AD, Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, challenged a well-known prostitute to a competition to see who could have sex with more men in a 24-hour period. The contest lasted through an entire night and day, and Messalina won, having serviced 25 men while her opponent admitted defeat. Let that sink in. The Empress of Rome, the mother of the heir to the imperial throne, supposedly spent a full day and night in a public brothel, competing with a sex worker to see who could service more clients. If true, this wasn't just scandalous, it was a complete obliteration of every social boundary that defined Roman civilization. To understand how insane this story is, you need to understand Roman attitudes about prostitution and social class. Rome had plenty of brothels. Prostitution was legal, regulated, and considered a necessary part of urban life. But there was an absolute wall separating respectable women from prostitutes. Respectable women were defined by their sexual restraint and fidelity to their husbands. Prostitutes were defined by their availability to any man with money. A woman who crossed that boundary didn't just lose respect, she lost her legal status as a Roman matron. Roman law specifically stated that women who behaved like prostitutes forfeited the legal protections that came with being a citizen wife. They could be treated, essentially, as prostitutes themselves. So if Messalina really did this, she wasn't just being rebellious or sexually adventurous, she was legally and socially destroying herself, throwing away the most privileged position in the Roman world to work in a job that was literally at the bottom of Rome's social hierarchy. But here's where it gets complicated. Pliny the Elder is our only source for this specific story. Tacitus, who wrote the most detailed and generally most reliable account of Claudius's reign, doesn't mention it. Suetonius, who loved collecting scandalous stories about emperors and their families, doesn't include this particular tale in his biography of Claudius. Dio Cassius, writing even later, doesn't reference it either. Pliny mentions this story in a section of his Natural History about extraordinary examples of sexual behavior in humans and animals. He's not writing history in the way Tacitus was. He's collecting remarkable and shocking anecdotes. And Pliny was a member of Rome's senatorial elite, the same class that had every reason to despise Messalina's memory. Modern historians have spent decades debating whether this competition really happened. Some argue that elements of it might be true. Roman emperors' wives did sometimes venture into parts of the city that were considered inappropriate. Ancient sources do agree that Messalina had multiple extramarital affairs, and there's a documented pattern of powerful Roman women being fascinated by transgressing social boundaries. But here's the thing about stories like this. In ancient Rome, accusing a powerful woman of sexual depravity was the most effective way to destroy her reputation and justify her destruction. It happened over and over again. Julia, daughter of Augustus, was exiled on adultery charges that were almost certainly exaggerated for political purposes. Agrippina the Younger, who would become empress after Messalina, would face similar accusations. It was a standard playbook. Woman gains too much power. Accusations of sexual misconduct follow. Woman is destroyed. So, did the brothel competition really happen? We'll probably never know for certain. What we can say is this. The story served a purpose. It took a woman who had wielded real political power, who had influenced imperial policy, who had built her own network of clients and supporters, and reduced her to a one-dimensional character defined entirely by sexual excess. But whether the brothel story is true or not, what's absolutely certain is that Messalina was doing something that terrified Rome's elite. Ancient sources are unanimous that she was engaged in multiple affairs, not for pleasure alone, but as part of a deliberate strategy to accumulate power and destroy rivals. Tacitus describes how Messalina used accusations of adultery as a weapon if someone opposed her politically, if someone had wealth or property she wanted, if someone stood in the way of her plans, she would arrange for them to be accused of having an affair with her. The punishment for adultery with the empress was death, and their property would be confiscated. It was the perfect crime. Get rid of your enemies and inherit their wealth in one move. She wasn't just breaking rules for the thrill of it. She was using sex as a tool of political warfare in a system that was supposed to keep women under control. And every affair, every transgression, every boundary she crossed made the men who actually ran Rome's government more desperate to stop her. The freedmen who controlled access to Claudius, men like Narcissus and Pallas, watched Messalina building her own power base with growing alarm. Senators whose colleagues were being destroyed on trumped-up adultery charges lived in terror that they might be next. And everyone in Rome's elite understood that as long as Messalina remained empress, no one was safe. So whether she really competed with a prostitute in a brothel or not, the message of that story was clear. This woman has gone so far beyond acceptable boundaries that she's become a threat to the entire social order. She's not just an empress anymore. She's something dangerous that needs to be eliminated. And Messalina, according to every ancient source, wasn't done pushing boundaries. In fact, she was about to do something so shocking, so politically suicidal that it would give her enemies exactly the justification they needed to destroy her completely. Forget the brothel stories for a moment. Whether Messalina actually competed with prostitutes or not, here's what we know for certain happened. People who got in her way started dying. And not quietly. We're talking about systematic political murders disguised as treason trials, with Messalina orchestrating the destruction of some of Rome's most powerful families. Let's start with Valerius Asiaticus. He was one of the richest men in Rome, had been consul twice, and owned the famous gardens of Lucullus, one of the most spectacular properties in the city. In 47 AD, Messalina decided she wanted those gardens, so she engineered his destruction. According to Tacitus, Messalina convinced Claudius that Asiaticus was plotting against him. The evidence was manufactured, the trial was a sham, and Asiaticus knew exactly what was happening. Rather than face execution, he was allowed to commit suicide, which was considered a mercy because it meant his family could keep part of his property. Except they couldn't keep the gardens of Lucullus. Those went straight to Messalina. But Asiaticus wasn't her first victim, and he wouldn't be her last. In 42 AD, Appius Silenus, who had married Messalina's mother, was executed on suspicion of conspiracy. Tacitus and Suetonius both suggest Messalina orchestrated this, possibly because Silenus had rejected her sexual advances, possibly because he posed some political threat we can no longer identify. Either way, he was dead, and Messalina's power grew. Then there's Julia Livilla, Messalina's own cousin. She was the sister of Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus, and represented another branch of the imperial family with its own claim to legitimacy. Around 43 AD, she was accused of adultery with the philosopher Seneca. Both were exiled. Julia Livilla died shortly after, probably murdered on Messalina's orders. Seneca survived only because he had powerful friends who protected him. Here's the pattern that ancient sources document repeatedly. Messalina would identify someone with wealth, power, or status. She would manufacture accusations against them, usually involving adultery or conspiracy. She would use her influence over Claudius to ensure their conviction, and then she would collect their property, their positions, or whatever else she wanted from their destruction. Some historians have argued that calling these Messalina's murders is unfair, that Claudius was emperor and ultimately responsible for these executions, and they're right that Claudius signed off on all of this. But multiple ancient sources are clear that Messalina was the driving force behind many of these prosecutions, and that Claudius was often manipulated or kept in the dark about what was really happening. The freedmen who ran Claudius's administration, men like Narcissus, were watching all of this with growing alarm. Every time Messalina destroyed a senator, she was demonstrating that she had more influence over the emperor than they did. Every property she confiscated made her richer and more independent. Every enemy she eliminated made her more dangerous to anyone who might oppose her. But here's what makes Messalina's situation more complex than just power-hungry empress murders rivals. She was operating in a system where this kind of ruthless political maneuvering was completely normal. Emperors and their families regularly destroyed perceived threats through manufactured treason trials. Tiberius had done it. Caligula had done it. It was practically standard imperial policy. The difference was that Messalina was a woman doing it, which violated every Roman assumption about proper female behavior. Women were supposed to influence politics subtly, behind the scenes, through their husbands. They weren't supposed to be the ones directly ordering executions and confiscating property. And Messalina wasn't being subtle about any of it. According to Tacitus, she would appear at trials, glaring at defendants, making her wishes clear. She built her own faction within the Roman elite, rewarding supporters and punishing enemies. She accumulated wealth openly, flaunting the gardens of Lucullus and other confiscated properties as symbols of her power. Think about what this meant for Rome's senatorial class. These were men who had spent their entire lives learning to navigate imperial politics, who knew how to survive under paranoid emperors by staying quiet and inoffensive. And now they were facing an empress who was actively hunting them, who could destroy them with a word to her husband, and who seemed completely uninterested in maintaining even the appearance of proper feminine restraint. The body count kept rising. Polybius, one of Claudius's own freedmen, was executed in 47 AD, possibly because he opposed some of Messalina's schemes. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, who was married to Claudius's daughter Antonia, was killed on adultery charges in 47 AD. His property, of course, was confiscated. By 48 AD, Messalina had been empress for roughly 8 years. She had survived multiple political challenges. She had eliminated numerous rivals. She had accumulated enormous wealth and built a network of supporters who owed their positions to her patronage. And she had given Claudius 2 children, including a son who was the heir to the imperial throne. She had, by any reasonable measure, she was one of the most powerful women in the Roman world, seemingly untouchable as long as she maintained her position as Claudius's wife and the mother of his heir. But power in imperial Rome came with a constant temptation to push just a little further, to test just one more boundary, to see what you could get away with. And Messalina was about to make a decision so spectacularly reckless that historians are still debating whether she had completely lost her mind or was attempting the most audacious political coup in Roman history. Because in the summer of 48 AD, while Emperor Claudius was away from Rome overseeing the grain supply at Ostia, Messalina didn't just take another lover. She married him, publicly, with witnesses, in a full traditional Roman wedding ceremony. While she was still married to the emperor, Gaius Silius was considered the most handsome man in Rome. That's not just gossip, that's how Tacitus, a serious historian, describes him. He was wealthy, well-connected, and had been designated consul for 48 AD, one of the highest honors in Rome. He had everything to lose, and apparently decided to risk it all for Messalina. Or maybe Messalina decided to risk it all for him. Or maybe, and this is what some modern historians suspect, neither of them was motivated by romance at all. Maybe what happened in the autumn of 48 AD was a desperate attempt at a political coup that just happened to be disguised as a marriage. Here's what we know for certain. documented by Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio Cassius. While Claudius was at Ostia, about 15 miles from Rome, handling the grain supply, Messalina and Silius went through a complete formal Roman wedding ceremony. Not a secret affair. Not a private exchange of vows. A full public wedding with witnesses, including multiple senators and members of Rome's elite. They signed marriage contracts. They performed the traditional rituals. Messalina wore the bride's veil. Silas made the ceremonial sacrifices. There were witnesses who confirmed the marriage under oath, by every legal and religious standard that Romans recognized. Messalina had divorced Claudius and married Silius, except, of course, she couldn't actually divorce Claudius. Roman women of her era needed their husband's consent to divorce, and the emperor definitely hadn't consented to anything. So what Messalina had actually done was commit adultery in the most public, most undeniable, most legally documented way possible. And since she was the empress, that adultery was automatically treason. The question that has haunted historians for 2,000 years is simple. Why? Why would someone as politically savvy as Messalina do something so obviously suicidal? Theory 1. She had genuinely fallen in love with Silius and lost her mind. Ancient sources love this explanation because it fits their narrative of Messalina as a woman ruled by uncontrollable lust, but it doesn't make much sense. Messalina had been conducting affairs for years. If she just wanted Silius, she could have had him as a lover without the public wedding that guaranteed her destruction. Theory 2. She thought Claudius was dying or about to be overthrown. If Claudius was removed from power, Messalina would need a new protector immediately. By marrying the consul designate, she would be positioning herself to maintain power through a new regime. Some historians find this plausible, but there's no evidence that Claudius was sick or facing any immediate threat in 48 AD. Theory 3, and this is the one that's gained traction among modern scholars. It was a coup attempt. By marrying Silius, who was about to become consul, Messalina was trying to create a new imperial dynasty. Silius would become Britannicus's stepfather and guardian. With the support of senators who were terrified of Narcissus and the other freedmen, they might be able to force Claudius to abdicate or simply eliminate him. Think about it. Messalina had spent 8 years watching Claudius be manipulated by his freedmen secretaries. She had seen them grow richer and more powerful while treating her as an obstacle to their control. She knew that if anything happened to Claudius, those freedmen would immediately try to eliminate her and her children to install someone more pliable as emperor. The marriage to Silius might have been her attempt to break the freedmen's power before they could destroy her. It was insanely risky, but the alternative was waiting until Claudius died naturally and hoping she could survive the succession crisis that would inevitably follow. Whatever her motivation, the plan fell apart almost immediately. Narcissus, Claudius's most powerful freedman, heard about the wedding within hours, and he recognized instantly that this was his opportunity to destroy Messalina permanently. Narcissus rushed to Ostia and informed Claudius that his wife had divorced him and married another man. According to Tacitus, Claudius's first reaction was confusion. He genuinely didn't understand what he was being told. Narcissus had to explain it multiple times, bringing witnesses who had attended the wedding to confirm that yes, the Empress had actually done this. Claudius's reaction, once he understood, was exactly what Narcissus needed: shock, betrayal, and rage. But Narcissus knew that Claudius was notoriously indecisive and might be talked out of taking action if Messalina got to him first. So Narcissus did something unprecedented. He temporarily took command of the Praetorian Guard himself, claiming he was acting on the emperor's authority. Meanwhile, Messalina heard that Claudius knew she had a choice: run and hope to escape, or try to reach Claudius and talk him out of ordering her execution. She chose the latter. She took her children, Britannicus and Octavia, and started walking from Rome to Ostia, hoping that seeing his children with their mother would soften Claudius's heart. She didn't make it. Narcissus had moved too quickly. Troops loyal to him intercepted Messalina in the gardens of Lucullus, those same gardens she had taken from Valerius Asiaticus just a year earlier. And there, in the property she had killed to possess, Messalina's story reached its brutal conclusion. According to Tacitus, Messalina was given a sword in order to kill herself. The traditional method for allowing aristocrats to die with some dignity. She couldn't do it. She held the blade to her throat multiple times but couldn't force herself to push it in. So the Praetorian tribune who had been sent to oversee her death did it for her. He ran her through with his sword. It was the same day that Claudius learned about her marriage to Silius. The same day. There was no trial, no formal process. No opportunity for Messalina to defend herself or explain her actions. Narcissus had orchestrated everything to happen so quickly that Claudius couldn't change his mind. And Silius, he was executed the same day, along with everyone who had attended the wedding. Senators, knights, anyone who had witnessed the marriage and could testify to what happened. They all died within hours. Narcissus wanted no survivors who might complicate the narrative or raise questions about what Messalina had really been trying to do. The speed and thoroughness of the purge suggests that Narcissus and the other freedmen saw this as more than just an adultery scandal. They saw it as a genuine coup attempt that needed to be crushed immediately and completely, with no loose ends. Claudius, according to Suetonius, was at dinner when Messalina was killed. When someone mentioned that the Empress is dead, he apparently asked for more wine and continued eating. Whether this story is true or invented to make Claudius look callous, it captured something real. The emperor had been so completely controlled by his freedmen that he didn't even seem to process what had just happened. To his wife of nearly a decade and the mother of his children, you'd think that being executed would be the end of Messalina's story. But in ancient Rome, death was just the beginning of a second, more thorough destruction. The Roman elite had perfected the art of killing someone twice, once in life and once in memory. And what they did to Messalina after her death reveals just how terrified they were of what she represented. The formal term for it was damnatio memoria, condemnation of memory. It meant systematically erasing someone from history, chiseling their name off monuments, destroying their images, forbidding anyone from speaking their name. It was reserved for the worst enemies of the state, people whose very existence needed to be retroactively cancelled. But here's what's interesting. Messalina didn't get a complete damnatio memoria. Her erasure was selective, partial, almost strategic. Some inscriptions mentioning her were defaced, some statues were destroyed, but others remained. Her children kept their status. And most tellingly, the Senate didn't pass any formal decree condemning her memory the way they had for other disgraced imperial family members. Why the half measures? Because Claudius needed Messalina's children to remain legitimate. Britannicus was still the heir to the throne. Octavia would later be married to Nero as part of the succession arrangement. If Messalina was completely erased from history, if she was officially declared a non-person, then the legitimacy of her children became questionable. So instead, what happened was more insidious. Messalina wasn't erased, she was rewritten. The official story that circulated through Rome was carefully calibrated to justify her execution while protecting her children's status. Yes, she had been a bad empress. Yes, she had committed adultery. But her crimes were portrayed as individual moral failures, not as political challenges to the system. According to Suetonius, Claudius was informed of Messalina's death while he was at dinner. He supposedly showed no emotion, asked for his cup to be refilled, and went on with the banquet as if nothing had happened. The next day he appeared before the Praetorian Guard and thanked them for their loyalty. He never mentioned Messalina's name. Within weeks, Claudius's advisors were already arranging his next marriage. The frontrunner was Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's own niece and the sister of the late Emperor Caligula. To marry her, Claudius would need to change Roman law, which prohibited uncle-niece marriages. The Senate, eager to please the emperor and probably relieved to have survived the purge that followed Messalina's death, quickly passed the necessary legislation. So just months after Messalina's execution, Claudius married Agrippina in 49 AD, and Agrippina brought her own son from a previous marriage, a boy named Nero, who would eventually become emperor and make everyone forget that Claudius's reign had ever seemed stable or competent. But what about Messalina's children? Britannicus, who was only 7 years old when his mother was executed, was gradually sidelined as Agrippina promoted her own son Nero. Octavia was married to Nero in 53 AD, making her simultaneously Nero's stepsister and wife, because Roman imperial family trees were nightmares of incestuous connections. Britannicus would die in 55 AD shortly after Nero became emperor. Ancient sources claim he was poisoned at dinner. He was 14 years old. Octavia would fare even worse. After years of abuse and humiliation by Nero, who openly preferred his mistress Poppaea, she was divorced, exiled, and executed in 62 AD. She was approximately 20. So Messalina's children, the ones whose legitimacy was supposedly protected by that careful, partial erasure of their mother's memory, both ended up dead before reaching adulthood. The system had destroyed their mother, and then, once she was safely gone and unable to protect them, it destroyed them too. The speed of it all is what's truly stunning. In 48 AD, Messalina was one of the most powerful women in the world, the mother of the imperial heir, seemingly secure in her position. Within a single day, she went from empress to corpse. Within months, she was replaced. Within a decade, both her children were dead and the dynasty she had tried to secure through them was finished. But here's what's even more disturbing than the erasure of Messalina herself. It's what happened to everyone else who got caught in the purge. Gaius Silius was executed immediately. That's well documented. But so were numerous senators, knights, and other aristocrats who had attended the wedding or were associated with Messalina's faction. Tacitus provides a chilling list. Juncus Vigilianus, a senator, Cornelius Lupus, who had been prefect of the watch, Pompeius Urbicus, a knight, Sophius Trogus, who had managed Messalina's property, and multiple others whose names Tacitus doesn't even bother recording because they weren't important enough. Some were executed publicly, some were allowed to commit suicide, some simply disappeared from the historical record, which in ancient Rome usually meant they died badly and nobody wanted to talk about it. The purge was thorough, systematic, and designed to eliminate anyone who might question the official narrative of what had happened. And that official narrative was already being shaped by the people who had orchestrated Messalina's destruction. Narcissus and the other freedmen made sure that the story told was one that justified their actions and protected their power. Messalina wasn't a woman who had tried to break free from a system that controlled her. She wasn't an empress who had attempted a political coup against the freedmen who really ran Rome. She was just a sexually depraved woman who had betrayed her husband for lust and gotten what she deserved. The sources we have written decades after Messalina's death all reflect this narrative to varying degrees. Even Tacitus, who was more critical and analytical than most ancient historians, accepts the basic framework that Messalina was driven primarily by sexual appetite rather than political ambition. But if you read carefully, you can see hints of a different story. Tacitus mentions that Messalina had built a powerful faction. He describes her political maneuvering. He notes that the freedmen saw her as a threat to their control over Claudius. All of this suggests a woman who was engaged in serious political warfare, not just collecting lovers. The question we can never fully answer is this: if Messalina had been a man, if she had been an emperor or a powerful male advisor doing exactly the same things, eliminating rivals, accumulating wealth, building a political network, would history remember her as a monster or as a successful political operator? Roman emperors regularly destroyed perceived threats through manufactured treason trials. They accumulated massive wealth through confiscation. They built networks of supporters and eliminated enemies. This was normal imperial behavior. But when Messalina did it, she became the most notorious woman in Roman history. Let's talk about what really happened here. Not the version that ancient sources wanted you to believe, but what the evidence actually suggests when you strip away 2,000 years of propaganda and misogyny. Messalina was approximately 30 years old when she died. She had been empress for roughly 8 years. In that time, according to hostile sources, she had conducted multiple affairs, orchestrated numerous political murders, accumulated enormous wealth, built a powerful faction within Rome's elite, and finally attempted either a spectacularly foolish act of passion or a calculated political coup. Every ancient source that mentions her portrays her as driven by insatiable sexual appetite. Pliny's story of the brothel competition, Juvenal's satire depicting her sneaking out at night to work as a prostitute, Tacitus's descriptions of her affairs, Suetonius claiming she would compete with prostitutes to see who could exhaust more men. This is the Messalina that history remembers, a nymphomaniac empress whose lust destroyed her. But here's what you need to understand about ancient Roman historiography. Accusing powerful women of sexual deprivation was standard procedure. It happened to Julia, daughter of Augustus, who was exiled for adultery in 02 BC. It happened to Agrippina the Younger, who would be accused of incest with her own son Nero. It happened to basically every woman who wielded significant political power in the Roman imperial system. Why? Because Roman political culture had no framework for accepting female power. Women were supposed to be chaste, obedient and subordinate to male authority. When a woman accumulated real power, when she made political decisions, eliminated rivals, and acted with the same ruthlessness that male politicians displayed constantly, the system couldn't process it through normal political categories, so it was reframed as sexual transgression. The woman wasn't politically ambitious. She was sexually insatiable. She wasn't eliminating rivals to protect her position. She was having affairs that happened to end in conveniently timed executions. She wasn't building a faction. She was collecting lovers. Every political act was translated into sexual terms, reducing a complex political operator to a one-dimensional caricature of female lust. Think about the specific accusations against Messalina and ask yourself, do these make any sense? The brothel competition, spending 24 hours servicing men in a public establishment where anyone could recognize her. That's not just scandalous, it's logistically absurd. How would the Empress of Rome, one of the most recognizable women in the ancient world, spend a full day in a brothel without someone alerting the emperor immediately? The public wedding to Silius makes more sense as a political move than as a romantic gesture. If Messalina was just driven by lust, she could have had Silius as a secret lover like she allegedly had multiple other men. The public wedding only makes sense if she was trying to accomplish something political, either securing an ally in case of Claudius's death or attempting an actual coup. Even the political murders attributed to her follow the same patterns as murders orchestrated by male members of the imperial family. Tiberius had eliminated threats through treason trials. Caligula had executed rivals and confiscated their property. Nero would do the same. But when Messalina did it, it was portrayed as being driven by personal grudges and sexual jealousy rather than political calculation. Here's what we can say with reasonable confidence based on the evidence. Messalina was a politically active empress who built her own power base, eliminated rivals, accumulated wealth, and attempted to maintain control in an environment where multiple factions were competing for influence over the emperor. She operated with the same ruthlessness that characterized male imperial politics, and she made a fatal miscalculation in 48 AD that gave her enemies the opportunity to destroy her. Everything else, the sexual stories, the brothel competition, the insatiable lust, might be true or might be the propaganda that Roman elites needed to justify eliminating a woman who had accumulated too much power and threatened too many interests. The speed and thoroughness of her destruction suggests that the freedmen who ran Claudius's administration saw her as a genuine political threat, not just an embarrassment. Narcissus didn't wait for a trial or a formal investigation. He seized control of the Praetorian Guard, ensured Messalina was killed before she could reach Claudius, and immediately purged everyone associated with her faction. That's not how you deal with an adulterous wife. That's how you crush a political coup. And a partial damnatio memoria, leaving some traces of Messalina while destroying others, suggests careful political calculation. They needed to discredit her enough to justify the executions, but not so completely that her children's legitimacy would be questioned. It was a delicate balance, and they managed it successfully. The irony is perfect. Messalina played the game of imperial politics with the same ruthlessness as any male competitor. She eliminated rivals, accumulated wealth, built factions, and made power moves. And for doing exactly what male politicians did constantly, she became the most notorious woman in Roman history, remembered not as a political operator but as a cautionary tale about female sexuality run wild. The ultimate tragedy isn't just what happened to Messalina, it's what happened to the truth about her. We'll never know for certain whether she really competed with prostitutes in a brothel. We'll never know if the public wedding to Silius was a love match, a panic move, or a calculated coup attempt. We'll never know how many of her alleged affairs were real versus how many were invented by enemies after her death. What we do know is that a 30-year-old woman who had wielded real political power for 8 years was executed within hours of being accused, without trial, without opportunity to defend herself. We know that everyone associated with her was purged. We know that her children were eventually killed once they were no longer useful. And we know that the story that survived was written by the men who destroyed her and had every reason to make sure she was remembered as a monster. Rome didn't just kill Messalina, they killed her twice, once in the gardens of Lucullus in 48 AD, and once in every history book written afterward. Because a woman who played the forbidden game of political power had to be transformed into a cautionary tale about female sexuality. It was the only way the system could make sense of what she had done and justify what they had done to her in return. The forbidden game that nearly destroyed Messalina wasn't sex, it was power. And in ancient Rome, that was a game women were never supposed to win.